Have you ever tried to pick someone up on a logical inconsistency or call them a hypocrite? It's kind of satisfying to be able to apply consistent logic to highlight someone's hypocrisy, or in their opinion, or in their argument. It's a bit like solving a puzzle and watching it slot into place and proving how you're right and how you're the smart, reasonable person in the room who's applying the rules without any prejudice or bias. I've talked about analogies before in a video that I made a long time ago, and I want to make a similar point in this video.
Weddings are like little girls' tea parties, except the women are the stuffed animals, the men are making them talk, and they're not drinking tea, they're drinking antiquated gender roles.
When you're drawing an equivalence between two matters in order to accuse someone of being a hypocrite, it's a bit like making an analogy.
I know what it is. It's like a thought with another thought's hat on.
Just because two things are similar in some senses, there are obviously going to be ways that those two things are different. That's why they are two things and not the same thing. The differences between those two things might be trivial, so the rule might apply consistently, but they might be important in ways that will impact how the rule applies in both cases. And let's start with a basic example. If I tell my 3-year-old daughter that it's overindulgent to eat more than 2 biscuits, and then I eat 3 or 4 biscuits myself, does that make me a hypocrite? Should the biscuit rule apply to both of us equally? My toddler doesn't know the word hypocrite, but she knows how to apply this rule to each of us in order to justify her request for an additional biscuit. If she sees me eating more than 2 biscuits, she's going to start wondering why she's only allowed 2. In my defense, I might say that I'm a lot bigger than a 3-year-old and I need to eat more. Pointing out hypocrisy makes people feel smart, and it can sometimes be a tool for trying to get something you want, which I think is why you see it all the time in intellectual debates. It's a way to win points against your opponent, to make it seem like they are applying logic in a self-serving way and you are the reasonable person applying logic consistently. But really, it's not that smart. If my 3-year-old can do it, maybe don't pat yourself on the back too hard for calling someone a hypocrite. Figuring out how two things differ from each other and which of those differences are relevant and which are arbitrary is often slightly more sophisticated than just pointing out hypocrisy. Although it is often taken too far in a way that people often call mental gymnastics. Let's look at another example that comes from the Adam and Sitch show, a live stream that I watched. This example is from weeks ago. I've been trying to make this video for ages and not finding any time to film it.
I thought Matt and I were in agreement on this. I thought we agreed that young people are stupid and make terrible decisions. Like, that's why we discourage people from getting married young, right? I mean, you fucking idiot. Like, you totally you undermine all of your work on the trans stuff. Like, you come out and say, listen, don't you think people are a little young to make these life-altering decisions? Yeah, getting married is like a life-altering decision. Yeah, exactly.
That's a fantastic point, and I didn't even think about that. But you're right. I mean, I think the main avenue of attack would be Matt is being a hypocrite if he thinks that 17-year-olds can go out there, get married, have children, but not transition.
Well, I would discourage both. Like, that's my thing.
I would too. I'm just saying.
To be consistent, I think the principle we're looking at is wisdom comes with some age and experience.
Right.
And asking people to make life-altering decisions when they have no age or experience is, I mean, not a good way to go. And it fits on both the trans issue and it fits on the getting married too young.
We understand that an impulsive, immature teenager might regret either of these decisions one day, that is, medical transition or marriage or pregnancy. And we as adults want to protect teenagers from their own bad decision making. So the legal autonomy of teenagers is a continuous battleground, whether it be smoking, drinking, voting, all of these things that we decide becomes one's own responsibility at a certain age. When it comes to social and sexual matters, teenagers are especially notorious for making bad decisions that they later come to regret. their level of impulse control isn't as good as an adult's, and their sense of self and their sexual desires has not yet kind of leveled off and stabilized. Adam and Sitch agree with me that a teenager, that is someone under the age of 18, is not old enough to make decisions about taking life-changing hormones or getting life-changing surgeries for the purposes of gender transition. But Adam and Sitch seem to make the equivalence that because a teenager is not yet ready to make those decisions, we then have to apply the logic consistently that they are also not old enough to make decisions about marriage and pregnancy. So a teenager who wants to get married or who wants to get pregnant and start a family, or a teenager who is pregnant who wants to marry the father of her child in order to start that family off with a good stable foundation, is considered to be just as likely to be deluded and confused as a teenager seeking gender transition, at least to the degree that if either of these actions is to be prohibited, then both of these actions must be prohibited, because that's what it means to be consistent. And there's a certain logic to that. But if believing that line of reasoning is what it takes to be consistent, I'd rather be a hypocrite. These things do not have equal moral weights, in my opinion. Getting married and having a child is probably the most celebrated events of your life. Medical transition is a dangerous treatment that should only be undertaken as a last resort if it's going to be legal at all. But in the current year, the general opinion of marriage has never been lower. These days, we like to celebrate freedom and personal expression of identity and sexuality, and so to restrict oneself to an outdated custom that ends in failure most of the time is somewhat counteractive to the current values of our time. On the other hand, people who are campaigning for medical transition to be available to people of all ages argue that it's roughly equivalent to a heart transplant or chemotherapy, in that it's dangerous and has risks associated with it, and there are certainly downsides, but that it is medically necessary. So although marriage used to be considered both necessary and safe, it's now considered neither. On the other hand, medical transition is considered to be dangerous, yes, but necessary, or absolutely vital by the campaigners. So whether you see medical transition as equivalent to self-mutilation or equivalent to a life-saving heart transplant is more or less a matter of taste. And that's how you get people like Adam and Sitch who land in the middle, seeing these two counter points and landing somewhere between the two and saying that, oh, well, it's basically the same. And the way things are going, it seems that the people whose taste matters are of the opinion that medical transition is in and marriage is just so out. And to say otherwise is extremely old-fashioned and conservative. Let's look at just one more example. The civil rights movement was justified by the principle of equality. Everyone knows the Martin Luther King Jr. quote about treating people according to the content of their character and not the colour of their skin. That principle used to be championed by the campaigners against racism. That was what the civil rights movement was for. And for a long time, they wore that principle as a badge of what it means to be just, what it means to be fair in modern society. But now this quote is often trotted out not by the campaigners against racism, but the campaigners against anti-racism, which is to say people who are unhappy with the direction that anti-racism has taken lately. Let's just say since Black Lives Matter became a prominent voice in the conversation a few years ago. This current generation of anti-racist campaigners say that it is not sufficient to merely be colorblind or to be not racist. One has to be anti-racist actively. And to be anti-racist means to give some kind of extra consideration or extra benefits to black people. When it comes to university applications and even hiring practices in the workplace, we're now seeing more and more application of things like quotas and preferential hiring for what we now think of as people of colour, which is to say not white people. And this has caused a lot of people to get up in arms and to trot out this Martin Luther King Jr. quote about treating people on the content of their character. How dare they? I bet Martin Luther King is rolling over in his grave. He just wanted equality, and now the people who have picked up his mantle and walked with it are against that very principle of equality, apparently. That was the rough line of argument that myself and a lot of other people were making starting a few years ago, when you could make a pretty good grift off of this line of reasoning for a while. And I expect that there are still a lot of people, especially online, who are making a good grift of it. But for me, it started to get a little bit stale, and I started to find more. And as I started to learn more about how power really operates, that kind of line of reasoning of applying consistent logic and trying to catch out people using their own line of argumentation, it started to sound a lot like what my daughter does when she wants more biscuits. When you point out the flaw in someone's reasoning, it doesn't work like a magic spell that suddenly forces them to do what you want. It might work in a court of law when you have the power of the legal system to back you up, but when you don't have any power to enforce your own logic and principles, even if you're completely correct, it won't achieve anything. You're reduced to the status of a little 3-year-old who's begging for biscuits. When I make rules for my daughter, which I then break myself, I have my reasons for doing that, and I try to explain those reasons to her so that she understands that the rules are important and that there is a logic to the rules that I enforce. Well, that's what I like to think anyway, but maybe I really am just a self-serving hypocrite for scoffing biscuits while I limit her to just 2. All the reasons that I cite for eating additional biscuits I just invented on the fly and post hoc. The truth is that when I want more biscuits, I have unrestricted access to them, and I have money to buy them, and so I just eat as many as I want. That's the real story here. That's how the world actually works. I can reach the biscuits on the shelf that she can't reach. I have money to buy them, and she doesn't have any. So the logic that I apply to the situation might be valid or it might be invalid, but it makes no difference to the final result. This is an ethical frame that's sometimes called might makes right. Arguably, it's not an ethical frame at all, it's more of a law of nature. There's no ethical laws written into the fabric of reality. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. The illusion of ethical principles is just what the people in power apply to a situation in an attempt to make it more palatable to the people who don't have power, so that they won't be a vicious coup. Maybe that's what I should say to my daughter as I stand over her with my mouth full of biscuits. Maybe that would help her to understand how the world really works. But ultimately, I want to show my daughter how she should act when she has power over others. I want to be an example of someone who applies the rules consistently, when it benefits me and when it doesn't. So in truth, when she applies a valid line of reasoning, I reward her by giving her what she's campaigning for. I do yield to her because I love her, and when she wins, it's usually a win for me too. But out there in the real world, where things really matter, the people who have power over us often don't love us, and they don't mind going back on their previously stated principles when it benefits them to do that. Martin Luther King appealed to the principle of equality because he wanted to improve the situation of Black Americans. He may have truly believed in that principle of equality, but he may not have. If MLK were alive today, he would probably still want to improve the situation of Black Americans, but would he still believe in the principle of equality if it hampered that aim, that goal? Would he still uphold the principles of colorblindness, or would he be an anti-racist, as that we are seeing these days? coming from Black Lives Matter. I really don't know one way or the other. I'm not a mind reader or a necromancer. So if you think you know what Martin Luther King would have believed if he were alive today, I think you don't. Anyway, join me on Fridays for Women's Hour. That's every Friday at 9 p.m. on this channel. Thank you for watching, and I hope I will see you again soon.